Baltimore, 1946. A city of 900,000. Streetcars dominated Main Street. A new office building in the Inner Harbor was being built, and after serving in World War II, a Calvin Johnson arrived home to Baltimore City. Johnson was a 19-year-old black man met with the same racially segregated city that he had left before the war. This racial divide permeated the very makeup of the city. African Americans made up 1/5 of Baltimore's population, but only took up 1/50th of the city's area. Calvin Johnson, like so many, was resentful and angry about his second-class citizenship. Not even his experience serving his country made a difference in how he was treated. He was still kept in the back of the streetcar, still denied entry into department stores, still turned away from lunch counters. At the same time, a drug called heroin was making its way into Baltimore. Only 30 people used it in Baltimore at the time, a figure that gives necessary context to the incredible expansion of addiction in the coming decades. Within 5 years, the number of addicts in the city grew from 30 to 300, and as people turned to petty crime, the very first narcotics squad in Baltimore was created. At the same time that heroin was making its first waves in Baltimore, Spiro Agnew was being elected governor of Maryland. Spiro Agnew was Baltimore born and raised, Johns Hopkins educated, and had his eye on the White House. Agnew ran as vice president on the Republican ticket in 1968, right under a man named Richard Nixon. The two defeated their Democratic opponent, and in 1969, Nixon and Agnew had taken the White House. Nixon took a firm stand against drugs. On June 17, 1971, he officially declared a war on drugs, pledging to take a hard line on drugs in cities, using law and order. His efforts were applauded by the public. At the time, using drugs was a symbol of youth, teenage rebellion, and social upheaval, something that America's older generation resented. Nixon planned to heavily crack down on drug dealers who he painted as the villains, the criminals bringing this public enemy number one to cities. He pushed for an aggressive policy that relied heavily on rehabilitation for addicts and jail time for dealers. Under his policy, drug dealers could receive 15 years in prison for a first offense, 30 years for sale to a minor, and up to life in prison if they are involved in a criminal enterprise. Nixon did, however, direct the majority of funds towards research for rehabilitation, not incarceration, under the pretense that the root cause had to be addressed in order to solve the problem of crime. Nixon also moved marijuana to Schedule I, the most restrictive category of drugs, and with the drug abuse law enforcement founded a year later, the war on drugs had officially begun. In 1973, Spiro Agnew was forced out of office under charges of extortion, tax fraud, bribery, and conspiracy, a year before Nixon did the same thing during Watergate. Jimmy Carter was elected next in 1976, and he held a very different stance on drug use. Carter wanted to decriminalize marijuana, a sentiment shared with the public at the time. 11 other states had decriminalized possession of marijuana. In a couple of years, though, that tide shifted as parents began to fear their teenagers using marijuana. Ultimately, marijuana was caught up in a larger cultural shift away from the perceived permissiveness of the 70s. This shift, of course, is perfectly encapsulated by Ronald Reagan and his presidency. Reagan's administration saw witness to an unprecedented rise of incarceration rates in America, riding on the back of increased public concern fueled by media portrayals of crack-ridden inner cities. Dealers and addicts' zero-tolerance policies rose to the national spotlight. Nancy Reagan launched her famous Just Say No campaign, and in California, the DARE campaign began with its organizer, Daryl Gates, saying that he believed casual drug users should be taken out and shot. Drugs were portrayed as the ultimate danger to society, and their use criminal and inexcusable. Commercials like this were aired daily.
This is your brain. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
The message was that drug dealers were monsters. They were the reason that inner cities were crumbling, not Reaganomics, lack of welfare, loss of jobs, or the real problem of addiction. All of these things propelled drug abuse into the very forefront of America's consciousness. In 1985, 2 to 4% of U.S. citizens believed that drug abuse was America's number one problem. But in 1989, after media attention, as well as an explosion of crack use in cities like New York, that number had risen to 64%. This political hysteria pushed tough-on-crime legislation into Congress, namely the Anti-Abuse Drug Act of 1986. The act directed about $1.7 billion to the drug crisis, but also, more importantly, put mandatory minimums for drug possession into place. The problem was that the act employed much harsher punishments for possession of crack cocaine than for powder cocaine, which are the exact same drugs save for the way that they are taken. The only difference was that crack cocaine was more likely to be used by black people, while powder cocaine was used by whites. By enforcing laws on crack cocaine much more seriously than powder, when the U.S. prison population exploded, it was those black and Latino communities getting thrown in prison and not the white people who use powder cocaine to the exact same degree. The U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, including Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. We have a prison population of over 2 million, whereas 30 years ago it was 300,000. That's over a 900% increase, and within that population, 2 out of 3 prisoners is black or Hispanic. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial minorities. The powder cocaine crack cocaine divide, while having majorly influenced the disproportionate number of minorities in prisons, is not the only thing to blame. The legislature that brought unfair policies into inner cities capitalized on the fear of black drug dealers, who were labeled thugs and portrayed by media as monsters. By crafting public opinion, Reagan and the rest of the government's war on drugs criminalized people, not crime, an action that resulted in an unprecedented prison population that left cities hollowed and empty. Today, Baltimore's most recognizable characteristic is the class disparity between neighborhoods, the experience of going from one block lined with clean, occupied houses to another with abandoned buildings and litter. This is the direct effect of the war on drugs, with a large amount of Baltimore's black population in prison on drug charges. 300 million Maryland tax dollars a year go towards incarceration in Baltimore alone. The communities with the most incarceration also experience higher unemployment and school absence rates, more abandoned buildings, lower life expectancy, and lower incomes. Certain communities like Sandtown Winchester and Harlem Park have severe problems like lead poisoning and homelessness. Perhaps not so coincidentally, 17 million tax dollars a year go to locking up people in Sandtown Winchester and Harlem Park alone. Though it was technically outlawed in 2013, the concept of stop and frisk is still used in everyday policing. Within the city, police cars stay parked on the corners with high criminal activity and watch for so-called suspicious characters on the street. The claustrophobic atmosphere of these neighborhoods is easily forgotten by citizens of Baltimore in richer, whiter neighborhoods. Ultimately, though, the government's stand against drugs harmed and continues to harm the everyday citizens of the city, in addition to those involved in the actual drug trade. It was not a war on drugs, but a war on working-class minorities.